When his house burnt down in the Great Fire that swept through Edo in 1682, the poet Matsuo Basho shaved his head, adopted the black robes of a monk, and set out, accompanied by a succession of friends, on a series of poetic pilgrimages. Well, that's the first sentence of my new book, The Farther Away, but it's peculiarly apposite to Pico Iyer, who's joining me today, because in 1990, Pico's family home burnt down in a wildfire, and although by that time he had already started on a series of poetic pilgrimages, this was the beginning of a new one. Needing somewhere to stay, he went to a Benedictine monastery on the Californian coast. And though not himself a Christian, he's been back there more than 100 times over the decades. And that experience is the subject of his new book, Aflame, which we'll be talking about later. Pico and I first met when we were at school together. We had adjacent desks in our English literature classes. But since then, Pico's had an extraordinary life. He joined Time magazine in 1982 as a writer on world affairs and has reported from all over the world. He's described himself as a multinational soul on a multinational globe. Taking planes, he once wrote, is as natural to me as going to school. I fold myself and carry it around as though it were an overnight bag. He's written almost 20 books now, which are sometimes described as travel writing, but I think they're better described as between the monastery and the airport, because though they are, in a sense, travel writing, what the monastery represents seems to be always a part of the books. Aflame has a commendation from the Dalai Lama, which I would have thought is not true of many travel writers. Before we talk, though, I thought we might begin by talking about Japan and talking about Basho. My book sort of begins in Japan because though I've only been there once for a few days, it gripped my imagination ever since I was at school. I used to imagine wandering around the Japanese landscape as a Zen monk like Basho, but I never actually did anything about it. But you're in Japan now, and you've been living there for many years. And as I remember, you did actually begin by living in a Zen monastery, even if only very briefly. But have I remembered that right?
Yeah, you remember it exactly right, Roger. I mean, I'm just so happy to get a chance to see you again. And of course, the last time we met was on those few days when you were visiting Japan. And it's so apposite to begin there because I remember, I think I saw you just before you made your way to Basho's hut in Western Kyoto. And I think what we were talking about is that Kyoto is very different, I think, from what some people romantically imagine and what I romantically imagined when I came to live in a temple. And so far as you saw, it's this very big, modern, bustling city, larger than Detroit, filled with high rises and taxis, and very glamorous modern place. And yet, as you saw, it's ringed by hills on three sides, and it has 1,600 Buddhist temples. And there in the west, tucked away just next to the bamboo forest, which is almost impossible with tourists these days, is the hut where Basho spent time. And I think when I think of that, it sounds like your book, The Farther Away, and my book, in the sense that I think we share this belief that in the middle of the clamor of the world, with all the traffic roaring around and all these distractions, still you can find these sanctuaries and almost these sacred places. I think Basho's hut in Western Kyoto is a perfect example. And I think that, I mean, you did find real peace there, didn't you, when you went?
Yes, no, that's right. I mean, when we first went into the bamboo forest. There were a kind of forest of sort of selfie sticks with people, and I kind of thought this is not what I'd imagined. But actually, as you went on, and the sort of the selfie sticks melted away, and by the time we got to the hut, there we were more or less by ourselves there, and what really sort of touched me was, I mean, in Basho's poem, well, in his sort of travel books, he often sort of talks about sort of putting poems on in the places that he arrives and sort of hanging them there. And it was very touching for me to see people had done that, and their own little sort of haikus sort of stuck on the which was, I mean, it's just a lovely thing. I don't know if that's very common in Japan or whether it's just unique to there, but
Surprisingly common, you know, just not far from where I'm sitting here in Nara, 20 miles from Kyoto, there's a long line of cherry trees along a little canal. Every spring, each one of those trees has a little haiku written by a 10-year-old or a 9-year-old. And so haiku, because it's so in certain ways approachable, I think it's still common parlance in a way, and it's a kind of poetry that's much easier to write even for a child than a sonnet or a villanelle might be. I know every week sometimes my wife, who's Japanese, will turn on the TV and there's an aged matron in a kimono telling you how to write a haiku, and having celebrities write haikus and telling them that's not good enough or you don't have enough feeling or whatever. So it's lovely that the haiku is alive and well, as is Basho. And it's interesting that you mentioned how my house burnt down as his did. And
yes,
the very
yeah,
night that my house burnt down, as you know, because I was writing for Time magazine at the time, I was caught in the middle of the fire for 3 hours, and then finally I escaped. And I wrote a little piece about being in the center of what was then the worst fire in Californian history. And I ended it with a haiku. And I think I might have misascribed it to Basho, but it was by somebody else who probably had learned from Basho. But
it gives a
just a
disciple,
reminder
yes.
that their wisdom is never far away. And the other thing, sorry to babble on, but the other thing when we talk about Kyoto is that its sister always seems to me to be Oxford, you know, the city where you live and the city where I was born and grew up, in the sense that Oxford too, you know, it's sort of industrial city with the Morris Motor Works and a lot of people in the center, but you step through a doorway and suddenly you're in the 15th century and you're in a place of absolute calm where you might be hearing, you know, beautiful music like the one that we were just hearing from, you know, an adaptation of Julian of Norwich, but you suddenly back in something very ancient and deep in the middle of the congestion and noise of Oxford or Kyoto, I feel.
Yes, yes. And I mean, this, what really, and I suppose haiku was the first poetry that I sort of discovered for myself, really, rather than, you know, being sort of taught it by, um, and I mean, I obviously just knew it in translation, and but I suppose what sort of what I loved about it was you got these kind of little fragments of sort of kind of concentrated attention to something maybe very sort of small, but which kind of the whole world seemed to expand from as you sort of read it. And that seemed to be a very kind of unique. I mean, it's you obviously find it in a way in other sorts of poetry, but it's a particularly sort of unique to sort of to Japan, and yet it's I mean, the fascinating thing, you talk about it being in the middle of all um, of things that aren't necessarily poetic, and actually, what I well, when I started reading Basho's travel journals, which he wrote really after that time when his house burnt down, when he kind of in the last years of his life, he sort of set out on these sort of pilgrimages. Um, uh, and you get kind of the the little poems are kind of integrated with the very sort of mundane and the sort of problems of traveling. So you get the sort of the you know the house full, when he stayed out full of fleas and the people sort of keeping him awake at night, and then you get this little poem in the middle of it. I mean that also is you know very much what I find in your writing as well. You kind of put these two worlds together.
Oh gosh, it's so interesting you say that because I think you just described your last book too, The Farther Away. I mean, which is this mixture of poems and the prose narrative that's stitching them together. And it's funny because honestly, when I was reading The Farther Away again last week, I actually wrote down here concentrated, undistracted work. So I think the haiku was made for you, Roger. And I'm not surprised that you were drawn towards it at the age of 16. I think after your father mysteriously gave you a copy, because that's exactly what I find in your work, and especially your poetry. It's, there's a lot in a very, very short space. I was thinking today, it's very contained and it's radiant. And the other thing that really strikes me about haiku, I don't know if this applies to you or to me, is that there's usually very little first person, but it's full of feeling. And in some ways, the attention is always directed outwards, towards the falling cherry blossoms or the snow or the geese flying home. But you can sense how much that is evoking from and rhyming with something inside the poet's heart. And I think now days where there's so much concentration on what's going on inside ourselves, haiku is a kind of liberation from the self to remind us of something much larger, which is probably where we'd find, as it were, a deeper self. So I think, I mean, that part too, it's lovely that haiku can speak to us across 300 years now and hasn't lost a thing really. And
Yeah,
as with your poetry, I think one of the things I like about your poetry is a very strong sense of meter and form, which to me speaks for an order in the world. Almost there's some kind of a sacred order underneath the chaos of the world, and that your poetry bows before. Um, and and haiku uh, is also, I think, really making the same um, sort of sort of gesture because it's taking so many different things or all the details, as you were saying, as he's walking from place to place on a not always easy journey, and compressing them into a kind of jewel that restores one's faith in many things.
yes, yes. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. That you do get this. There isn't, as you say, this kind of first person. Um, that it is very much this outwards focus. But I mean, the other sort of lovely thing that I'd sort of found in hiking, and particularly in these sort of latter um, um, travel journals that he wrote, is actually there. I mean, though I think it's again a particularly nice thing in both in Chinese and Japanese things, this kind of collaborative aspect to it that I mean there's wonderful, I can't remember what they're called now, but sort of Chinese sort of they're little kind of books in which one painter will paint something and hand it on to the next painter and they'll paint something, and it's a kind of friendship book, as it were. And you get that in the linked poems, that sort of haiku can stand by themselves, but there are also these kind of linked forms where one person writes one haiku and the next person, and it's sort of they all sort of join together, and and you get, I mean, again in the narrow road to the far north, you get Basho with his the sort of friend who is traveling with him, and this is the poem by by him, and it's not whereas we think, as um, a poetry book is just the one person. There, he's quite happy to have all these other people sort of joining in with it, and that's, I think, a very lovely thing. And
Yes, yes. I mean, I think it's a variation. I was thinking haiku is so personal, but it's not about personality. And therefore you're right, it's a shared communal thing. I mean, that came across very strongly for me reading The Further Away, your book, in the sense that it's about a group of friends traveling from place to place, but you're also interconnecting with a group of friends of the past, and the ancients, as Samuel Palmer called his group of friends who are traveling. And so it's really about kindred spirits, and maybe therefore about something much beyond the self that we all share. Because I feel over and over your poetry is about freeing us from the self that gets in the way of the world, um, and releasing us to something much larger, which is exactly where people are likely to join hands across centuries or sharing a poem. I mean, when you were talking about Basho putting together a book with his friends and fellow travelers, I think spending time in a monastery has made me feel that anything I write there should really be signed anonymous. It has nothing to do with me.
yes,
And it's
yes,
not coming from me and it's not really relating to my experience out in the world. And it makes me think how if you pick a, an anthology of poems, probably the biggest contributor might well be the one called Anonymous, which is lovely. I think
Yeah,
that's ins
yeah,
yeah. Doesn't matter who it is, or it may come from 1,000 different people all at once, but it nonetheless is speaking for a certain wisdom that's often beyond uh, the personal. And I was thinking of Basho too, when I think in your book, your most recent book, you said something like, the winding road becomes a way. And of course, I was thinking the way is the Buddhist term for the path, the
mm,
pilgrimage that every
mm,
Buddhist, including Basho, is on. And all his walking is about being on the way to so to speak, on the road to better understanding impermanence and suffering and reality. And he'll look up at the moon, and I remember, oh well, the moon is sort of a Buddhist symbol for enlightenment. So in that sense, as with your pilgrimages, in his pilgrimages, nothing is accidental or casual, and it's all with a view to finding something much larger than the self, I suppose.
yes, yes, yes. Now I remember actually, I think it's probably actually when we were at school reading the introduction to the Ingmar Bergman's film of The Seventh Seal, where he talks about where people sometimes ask him what his aim is in his films and so on, and he tells the story of the building of Chartres, where uh, this whole sort of crowd of completely of every sort of section of society would sort of join together to bring the sort of stones down. He talks about people, rich men and poor, sort of roping themselves to the carts and bringing the sort of stones and there being a profound silence and it being actually no one knows who built the thing, but and he says that actually that is, when he feels that arts, when they sort of kind of cut themselves off from that, they've kind of lost their sort of meaning. But it's that actually is what he really wants his films to, he would like to be part of, building the cathedral, as it were, which I think is a lovely image.
Oh, just beautiful. Yes, I'm so glad you told me. I never knew it. And you also, I think you just mentioned the word I was going to invoke, which I think is another part of the special grace of basho and haiku, which is silence. Because in a poem that's only 17 syllables long, really it's essentially about what isn't said and what maybe cannot be said and what is beyond the reach of words, like the Buddhist talk of the finger pointing at the moon. And so I love the fact that Basho is really making a lot of space for silence if you just read his poems. And I know from your writing and from mine, silence seems to be the heart of everything, the
Yes.
answer to everything, maybe.
I mean, I just came across actually, just I was looking at the introduction to um, or English introduction to Basho's thing, and I came across this wonderful quotation from Basho, which I hadn't seen before, which he says, no matter what we may be doing at a given moment, we must not forget that it has a bearing upon our everlasting self, which is poetry, which I just thought
Ah,
was just I mean, and it actually reminded me. I mean, it's very close to what actually George Herbert says with that is a lovely poem when he says that a servant with this clause makes drudgery divine, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that and the action fine. And it's just that kind of, as you were saying at the beginning, the meeting of the everyday and the eternal is actually what you get so much in, well, both in Basho and in Herbert, actually. It's um,
yes, and in and in you. I mean, when I was reading The Farther Away, I was thinking, gosh, this could almost be called The Angels by the Motorway or something, because there's a lot of traffic in the book. But you're always feeling the sense of the sacred. And of course, some of the paintings, especially at the end, one of the paintings almost has the angels near the satanic mills. But it's exactly that same infusion. And I love, I mean, that quote you just read from Basho, almost I suggest, poetry is divinity, or it's an expression of something beyond itself. Because when you said the everlasting self, I was surprised that he ended which is poetry, because he could have said, which is truth or which is reality or something
Yes,
else.
yes, yes.
It's a lovely, rather exalted way of thinking of what art and poetry can do.
Yes, yes, no, that's right. I think it's that kind of taking of poetry in as a kind of metaphor almost for something else, really, isn't it? It's um, that Blake talks about Jesus, the imagination. It is
Yes,
the
yes.
same kind of yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, exactly so. That's right. And really, in making a poem, he was very much making a life, I think, Basho, which is probably why also the haiku you're distilling, you're cutting away so much that's extraneous to get to the heart of things. That's probably a very good definition of pilgrimage. I think in your book, The Farther Away, you say something, you have this lovely line about how one can make a pilgrimage without leaving home. And writing poetry is a good way of doing that, probably.
Yes, yes. Yes, I mean it's I mean in the my sort of poem I sort of which is kind of um is putting some of sort of Basho's making them into a kind of linked poem, but using some of Basho's um poems and putting them with my own. And but one of the ones I include is that one he wrote just when he was. Oh, and I should have turned off my email to sort of stop it. Never mind. You'll hear little pings throughout. um, that uh, just before he died, he wrote a sort of poem. I mean, like the sort of day before, where he kind of imagines himself sort of traveling on, though he's sort of, and then he comes in the day. I mean, the morning that he died, he actually went back to revise a poem that he'd written when he was in Kyoto in Urashiyama, and so it was very much for him. You know, the whole sort of passage of his life was sort of focused on. I mean, these moments of attention again were actually sort of taking him, as you were saying, to something beyond that, and that was what the kind of goal of his life was, which again is very moving to read. Um,
Yes, the beyond. And you probably know one reason why he's still taught in classrooms here is maybe his most famous poem. I don't, you may well know this, uh, is is when he went to a famously beautiful island called Matsushima in northern uh, Japan, and his poem in Japanese was Matsushima, yeah, Matsushima, yeah, Matsushima. So the whole thing is just the name of the place. In other words, it's beyond words. Poetry can never begin to catch or do justice to the beauty of this. It's as if you were to write a poem that just went, Derwent Lake, Derwent Lake, Derwent Lake.
Well, shall I read this poem? And I shall also try at the same time to share the picture. Um, uh, and well, actually just before I do, I might just read what Basho himself wrote about the place, that little hut in Kyoto. He says, the retreat of my disciple Kyorai is in the suburbs of Kyoto, among the bamboo thickets of Shimosaga, for it is an ideal place for meditation, for it is hushed in silence. Such is the laziness of my friend Kyorai, that his windows are covered with tall grass, and his roofs are buried under the branches of the persimmon trees. So here is the uh, poem, and this is the painting that I did in the Shimosaka wood by the hut. In holy places, drenched in poetry, like pearls of dew that soak a dried up path, you sit where Saigo sat beneath the tree. You stare at Matushima's starlit seas. You reach at last the Shirakawa gate and sleep in wayside inns besieged by fleas, as in a temple high on Hugaro. Within the southern valley where you lodge, a breath brings in the faintest scent of snow. So hanging your new poems on old shrines and linking verses as old friends link arms, a breath of silence breathes within your lines. And when, sick on the road, all journeys stop, along the dried up path, across parched grass, through hazing heat, the dream still travels on to where, within the Shimosako wood, past green light filtering down through green bamboo, the house of fallen persimmons once stood and stands there still, remote from rage and riot, a house in which a poet stared and wrote, surrounded by deep grass and deeper quiet. A basho hut within beneath a basho tree. I dip my brush and on my paper see a holy place, dew drenched in poetry.
Ah, so beautifully read and so beautifully written and illustrated too. What a treat.
And that last, well, you just saw at the end the picture of Basho's hut. I put next then to a place where Samuel Palmer lived, and then it sort of goes on to a place where George Herbert lived. So it's lovely sort of finding these, and that was really the starting point of the book, just kind of finding these places of silence that somehow linked with one another. Um,
Yes, and yeah, well, I think that you said linking verses like linking arms, and so yeah, it's a beautiful vision of interconnectedness, I think. Um, it strikes me too as I hear that, one of the beauties of haiku is you have to read it slowly. So there are often only about 6 words in the whole poem. So it returns you to a human pace. And in that way too, it sort of rescues you from the acceleration and roar of the world. And I feel your writing and what I aspire to do too is partly meant to bring us back to something slow and ancient and to free us from um, acceleration.
mm, mm. Well, I mean, I talk about, I mean, we've both been talking about silence there, and that's actually the subtitle of of Aflame is sort of learning um, from silence. Um, and I mean, before we sort of talk a bit more about what you mean by that, perhaps it might be good for you to describe how the well, not how the book came about, but how how your whole connection with the monastery came about. Because I mean, we mentioned that it started with the fire, but that it obviously didn't stop there. So, um,
Oh, yes. And interestingly, it hadn't obviously struck me till right now, but when you were 16 and beginning to discover Basho, in my holidays from school, was beginning to discover Big Sur, which is this rather enchanted, very undeveloped stretch of 60 miles of coastline in Central California, where to this day there are 2,000 people, only 2,000 people in this whole 60-mile range, and the population is actually going down. And as soon as you step into that area, the human becomes very small, and you're surrounded by tall redwoods and this vast expanse of Pacific Ocean and high cliffs. But yes, so the reason where this book began was that, as you said, my house burnt down, and so for many months thereafter, I was sleeping on a friend's floor as my mother and I slowly were reconstructing our life and building a new home. And another friend who was a school teacher came and he saw me on this floor and he said, "Come on, Pico, you can do better than this." And he said that every spring he took his students up to a retreat house, just 3.5 hours drive to the north. And he said even the most fidgety, distracted, phone addicted 15-year-old Californian boy only had to spend 3 days in silence. Something cooled down and cleared out in him. He found something beyond himself to the point where he said many of his students never wanted to come home again after 3 days. And so I thought, well, this is certainly something I should investigate. And my friend stressed that if nothing else, for what was then only $30 a day, so £20 a day, I'd have a bed to sleep in and a wide desk and a private walled garden overlooking the sea, hot meals, really quite a luxurious existence. And because you and I, when we first knew each other at school, had to go to chapel every morning and chapel every evening, and in my house we had to sing the Lord's Prayer in Latin on Sundays, I sort of thought, gosh, I know that Christian tradition quite well. I'm not sure I really want to go to a Catholic monastery. And as you said at the outset, I'm not a Christian. But one of the beauties of going there was as soon as I arrived, all my thoughts left me and they were left back down on the highway, but also all my preconceptions about what monks are fell away. I quickly found that these monks were the most open-minded souls I could imagine, to the point where they were opening their doors and their hearts to me and lots of other people who didn't necessarily share their faith, much less dogmatic, I think, than I am, or than many of my friends are. And also that in silence, names and definitions don't really matter. You're in a place beyond divisions. It's another form of that linking, I think. That if a group of us sit in a room and talk about our texts or our beliefs, we may fly off in different directions. But if we share a moment of silence, we probably remind us something deep that we all have in common, and it's beyond the reach of our theologies sometimes, or certainly our words. So anyway, it was so radically different from what I expected, and I felt so instantly at home. And I felt, you write in your book, The Further Away, it's one moment reality comes blazing through. And that's how I felt. In other words, I felt as if I'd stepped outside the masquerade that I'd taken to be real life and finally was touching something real. And finally had the lot of the clutter within me fall away and touch something that perhaps I'd forgotten. And I love the way, as you know, I'm sure, monks speak about the process of recollection. In other words, it's not a discovery necessarily. It's a recollection, which I take to mean two things. One is it's a bringing together of all the scattered parts so that finally one feels whole. And also recollection in the sense that it's a memory of some truth maybe one knew once upon a time, but that got lost in the rush of the everyday. And so it's not as if you're coming upon something new so much as you're uncovering something old that you should have known all along. Well, that's how I felt anyway. And again, I think that speaks for the spirit I feel in all your poetic pilgrimages, because you're essentially uncovering some truth and radiance and something holy that is everywhere in England and everywhere inside you, but sometimes gets lost along the way.
Yes, yes. I mean, one of the things I actually loved about the kind of form of your book is that, I mean, you call it lessons from silence, uh, but you don't actually sort of spell out. I mean, in a way, you've done that more here than you do in the book. You don't really sort of spell out what those are. You just kind of allow them to emerge as you tell the story. And I assume that was entirely sort of deliberate. That you, that part of what you actually learn from silence is not something you can exactly sort of teach in that way. That you have to experience it, and you kind of give us that experience in
I'm so
deciding your own.
glad you say, I'm so happy you say that, Roger, because I've got to confess, I don't know if you've had this experience. Lessons for Silence is the last title or subtitle I want. In fact, in England, the whole book is called Lessons from Silence. In America, I got them just to have but I don't feel I'm in a position to offer lessons of any kind, really. I'm just, and I don't think lessons are the point. So that was an editorial intervention. I would have, yeah, I never would have had that otherwise. So I'm glad if if you didn't feel you were on the receiving end of any lessons, because I don't think I should be on the giving end of any. What was I going to say? Well, it will come back to me.
Well,
That's
yes,
not.
well, I didn't know because when your book arrived, it wasn't called Aflame, so I didn't realize that was the English title, so I didn't put it on. But that is the for England, that's the
Oh,
that there we are.
you're ahead of me. I've never seen
You
this
haven't seen
before.
that, yes. Um,
No.
well, actually, now I can see on the back it has a. I don't know if that's going to be the actual picture, which is a slightly.
Yes.
I think
And
that's a nicer one, so I hope they use that one.
yes, exactly. I don't love that title, but I really love that picture. I was so
Yeah.
happy with that cover. Actually, it was taken by my wife just as we were walking down the monastery that I describe because she comes and shares that silence with me now. And just with her iPhone, she took a picture, and I never dreamed that they'd be nice enough actually to use Hiroko's photo on the cover. But I think, yes, when you're talking about how really the book is a series of vignettes, I think of it almost as a series of parables. And I remember you wrote a book ages ago called Sacred Allegory, but there's just this sense that if you're in a sufficiently uncluttered landscape, it goes back to haiku, really, every moment resonates and speaks for something much larger. And so I was very keen not to be doing lessons or conclusions or anything, but just to set these one scene after another. And the hope is the reader can take it into her heart and make whatever she wants of it. But it doesn't have to be reduced or simplified into an explanation, probably. And I think a lot of the writing we both love probably um, is of that kind. I remember, I think at the beginning of your writing life, you wrote fire sonnets, and so it was very important for me to have a flame as the title because, as you saw, fire plays such a large part in every corner of this book. And your poetry clearly reminds me a lot of George Herbert, but in this most recent book, it really reminds me of T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets. And of course, when you read Eliot, everywhere there's the devouring fire. Or I'm not doing justice to it, but the right kind of flames everywhere in T.S. Eliot, I feel.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, that's actually, um, well, I mean, that's one of the things I was going to ask you about because it's uh, at some point in the book you talk about having a conversation with one of the monks, and you say that you're writing an essay on the Song of Songs and the
Mm,
Book of Job, and
mm.
and you say sometimes I feel that everything I need to know is in them. And I mean, that really sort of resonated with me because those are the two books that I've most sort of focused on in the Old Testament. And the Song of Songs would actually got me to start trying to learn some Hebrew. And the Book of Job is a sort of book I sort of illustrated the last part of, and spent years sort of taking the pictures round some English cathedrals, and actually with some actors we actually dramatized it, or just read out the whole Book of Job, which but anyway, I'd love to know what you sort of say. You just leave that as sort of hanging sort of sentence in the book.
I love this convergence. Yeah, so I remember your paintings of the whirlwind, right? Which is that
Yes,
right?
yes, yes, no, that's right. Yeah.
And reading you, I'm not surprised that the Song of Songs would be so important. So I, I'm thrilled by that. So I suppose, you mentioned at the beginning, I've been lucky to travel quite a bit, but I think most of my writing, and you might relate to this, is about trying to bring hope and reality together. In other words, to look at the world as it is, but not to give up on hope. And I think, I find Job very tonic medicine, reminding us there are no guarantees. Life is never going to be easy. Faith is never going to be easy. And the most faithful is going to be tested the most, which is something monks probably experience every day. And yet, inarguably, there's there's just the glory and beauty of the world and springtime and arising all around us, which is hymned as wonderfully in the Song of Songs as anywhere I know. And so I never want to forget either of those two. I don't want to forget the beauty of the world and how it it inspires a sort of gratitude and faith that is just instantaneous, whoever you are, whatever your background is. And at the same time, you don't want to assume that even that degree of faith means all your problems are behind you. It's going to be plain
They're
sailing.
only
And I
just
think
beginning. Yes.
quite exactly, yes. I think we both know that, for example, monks or men who committed their whole lives to faith probably live closer to doubt than anyone. And I really bow before the courage of monastics, monks, and nuns in any order who's spending all their whole life in a cell alone, sometimes alone with their fears and their frustrations. I mean, it makes 40 days in the wilderness look easy by comparison to 40 years. sometimes. So it's one of the many things, apart from their extraordinary kindness and selflessness, that um, I so admire in them. And I remember there was one line in your book, and I hope I'm going to massacre it, but I hope not too much, where you talk about the strange internal theaters of the mind
Mm.
versus the epic oceanic
Yes,
something of
yes.
the soul, right? And
Yes, no, that's right. Yes, yes.
that's
It's actually talking about my friend Richard Webb's illustrations to Milton, which are the things he did during lockdown, um, when it was a very difficult period for him because um, his painting course that he'd been teaching for years it was suddenly um, abolished, and for no good reasons at all. And he was doing these illustrations to these huge illustrations to Paradise Lost, and he got to the sort of kind of uh, the moment in sort of hell in the thing, and he turned, oh, actually the temptation it was of Adam and Eve, and he produced these pictures of it. Suddenly went into a kind of theater, and you saw um, uh, they were there's Satan and Adam and Eve on a sort of stage with all these, and it was they were very sort of strange. Um, but then also he was doing these pictures of Adam alone, um, and they're vast pictures of just the single sort of naked figure walking by the huge ocean, which again I suppose is very much like the kind of landscape of Big Sur, which and yes, and I had yes, the strange eternal theatres of the mind, the epic ocean landscapes of the soul, which is again very much what you evoke in. I mean, there's a lovely sentence I think in the book where you say that the monastery is a place where self disappears and consciousness comes to seem as vast, as enveloping as the ocean around us, um, which.
oh, there we go. Yes, perfect. Exactly. And so those lines that you wrote about your friend's poem, that's the best description of what happens, when every time I step into that silence. As you said, I think I've made these retreats there more than 100 times over these 33 years, sometimes staying for as long as 3 weeks, sometimes staying with the monks in their enclosure and even in a monastic cell. And every time when I drive up, there's the usual chatter in my head. Yeah, worried about leaving my aged mother behind. I'm fretting about my deadlines. I'm upset that I'm missing a friend's birthday party. And as soon as I arrive there, all of that falls away because I think to some degree, all of my social self, all the chattering self in me falls away. And I am released to what feels like this epic oceanic landscape that's so much vaster, and it's such a relief to be out of Little Pico and into something much larger and more enduring, most likely. So I jumped upon that phrase when I saw it because I think that's a description of what so many of us are seeking. And again and again in your book, you talk about I think slaying the mind, or there's always this sense of getting away um, from the self, slaying the self, maybe you say, to something much more expansive and really more sacred. And that's certainly what I feel. So when I was reading your book the second time, I was thinking, oh, well, yeah, so Big Sur is my equivalent to the sacred landscapes you're describing, because it's out of time in its way. And for me, it's very visionary. And it's about disappearing into something huge, and the
Mm.
relief of um,
Yes, yes. But again, I mean, the image of fire which sort of comes through I mean, because you were talking about how the monastery is actually has been sort of surrounded by fire at different times. And I mean, incredibly sort of traumatic and alarming sort of way. I mean, just going back to the Song of Songs for a moment, I mean, it ends with that talking about love is as strong as death. It's jealousy unyielding as a grave. It burns like a blazing fire, the flame of the Lord. And it's this kind of I mean, I think again, somewhere you say the sacred is not a sanctuary, it's a force. It's a force field, in many ways, a forest fire. And I mean, it's a very powerful image.
Yes, and well, and there's fire everywhere in new writing for exactly the same reason. And if you live in the hills of California, you quickly realize that nature needs fire. It's a regenerative force. It thins the
Mm,
overgrowth,
mm,
essential to the rebirth of many things. It's a kind of Easter force. So we can't live without fire. But then the question is, how do we live calmly with fire? Which I think partly for me is a metaphor for how do we live with acts of God? In other words, how do we live with forces that are much larger than we are, that are going to rewrite our destiny much more than we ever do? You know, I remember
mm,
probably when you and I were in the same classroom at the age of 16, I had my life planned out, and I was so keen I was going to be master of my destiny and write out that, write myself into a future. And of course, life has upended me in any number of times, thank heavens. And that, we're saved as we grow older, I think, from the illusion that we can really make our future. And we're reminded that we're at the mercy of much um, larger things. And the other thing I was thinking of is that I think when I read The Further Away, I felt to some extent like all your paintings and all your poems, it's always bringing us to the gates of paradise. And I suppose that's what my book is trying to do too. Because the last book I wrote before this one, which I think you wrote to me about, but it's almost a companion piece because it's about cutting through illusions of paradise. We always put paradise, oh, it's going to be in Tahiti or Tibet, or it's going to be on a sunny day on an empty beach. And I was reading a lot of Paradise Lost um, as I was writing that, as a reminder of how the ambiguity of paradise and humanity and perfection don't really go in the same sentence. We're fallen beings, so we can't really live in paradise. And I think you almost cite it in your book, the line when Michael the Archangel leads them to the gates of paradise and says, you'll find a paradise within, happier far. I think something like that.
yes,
Um, so that's what the notion of a monastery is. Without going anywhere, monastics have created an image of the paradise, and that paradise is in the here and now. Paradise is regained in that sense, um, and whether or not we can ever manage to live there, it's a great thing to be reminded of its existence. And I feel your book is a lot about illumination and about finding light. And then when I had to do the audiobook for my book, I kept on noticing, gosh, the words that keep on coming back, light and love and joy and gold. And I'm sure you find too. I've never seen the world quite as despairing or divided as it is now. So if there's any time when it's useful for us to be reminded of light and paradise and hope,
yes,
it's
yes, yes, indeed. I mean, I think one of the most moving um, moments in your book are actually your encounters with Leonard Cohen, where you say that whenever you meet him, he asks if you were married, and then says the real training that sitting on top of a mountain is in meditation is easy by comparison, and that's very striking. I'm sure it's not easy, but I can sort of see what he's getting at there. It's, that actually these
yeah.
sort of um,
He always said he would always say, I don't think I included in the book, he always say, I don't have the domestic chops. He had a lot of other talents, but being married and settled in a relationship was never his gift. But, but really, the reason, one of the reasons he's in the book, though I don't really say much about it in this book, is that when I met him, he was 61, and he was living for 5.5 years as a monk, Zen monk, in a
Hmm.
cold, high, dark mountains behind Los Angeles, just shoveling snow and scrubbing floors and looking after the aged Japanese head of the community. And what made such an impression on me was here is one of the most cherished and celebrated singers in the world who could be doing anything and enjoying anything, anywhere with anyone. And he had chosen this life. And he said, This is the real profound and deep and voluptuous experience in life of all the things that he had sampled, and he'd probably sampled most of the so-called pleasures of the world. That monastic training seemed to him the deepest joy. And I think spending time with monks has maybe helped me to try to understand what joy is better, because I think they have told me that for them, joy is the happiness that doesn't depend on circumstance, which takes us back to the book of Job. Joy is what sustains monks, whether it's the Dalai Lama or my Benedictine friends, even when their lives are so difficult and the fires are racing down on them. Um, as you know, at one point in the book, I describe how yet again this remote hillside monastery in the middle of wilderness is being surrounded by wildfire flames, and a couple of monks stay back to defend their home. And the prior starts sending newsletters to concerned friends to keep us up to date. And at one point he says, well, we can see a lot of smoke and the flames are about 200 yards away from us, just at the top of the hill behind us. But don't worry, we're maintaining our offices, we're conducting vigils and vespers and matins in the chapter room. And then ends his message, blessed day all, he says, when it looks as if he and his home may not even survive that day. And
Mm,
as an example of courage and faith, I mean, really humbling, I think.
mm,
Um,
mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
and I mean, you're talking about how this extraordinary way that actually things can come out of destruction. Uh, and I mean, the other thing, I suppose, with Leonard Cohen, you're sort of there when he discovered that all his money has been sort of taken, and he has to sort of go back um, to sort of singing again, and yet what a gift that was to the rest of us. I mean, it's a
what a gift. Yes. And of course, as in any parable, it was when he was forced to go back to singing and giving concerts at the age of 73, he suddenly became more popular than ever before. And
mm,
yeah, the whole world took him to his heart. But I think, as you said, when people saw him between the ages of 73 and 80 giving his concerts, were very moved by it. I think what they were really responding to was the fact that he brought the sense of passion and intimacy and depth of a meditation hall right into the great concert halls of the world. In other words, he was not really a rock and roll singer, but there was some quality about him of modesty and disappearance that you were actually seeing a monk on stage. And, he was bowing before his fellow musicians. He was sometimes kneeling on the ground of the stage. And you felt that he was never trying to win you over or woo you to the person called Leonard Cohen, but
mm,
ushering you to something larger. And you may know, I mean, he wrote a song a long time ago called If It Be Your Will. And it belongs, I would say, with George Herbert, one of the great devotional um, poems from any tradition. I noticed when Edge from U2 was invited to sing in the Sistine Chapel, the song he delivered was If It Be Your Will from Leonard Cohen. And I think it was a wise choice because it's the ultimate prayer of submission and obedience.
mm, mm. I mean, again, very sort of moving thing you quote from him was that which was interesting because it was so different. I mean, when I was as a sort of schoolboy, I was reading sort of about sort of Zen um, things, and got fascinated by this kind of idea of enlightenment, and it just seemed. And yet, when he talks about, you sort of quote him as saying, "This is what this practice, this whole life is about, is sort of cleaning the bottom of a 107-year-old man." I mean, which is just so something that I mean Christians would resonate with so much, and it's so different from what I'd sort of imagined that sort of discipline was about, and it's just lovely to hear that.
Exactly. I was just going to say all my Catholic monk friends would instantly resonate to that. And Roger, you just described or explained why I didn't last when I moved to Japan hoping to live in a temple. I was 29 and I'd been living in New York City. And like you, I had those very romantic notions of what a Zen temple might be. And I arrived and it was all scrubbing floors and shoveling snow and sort of felt a lot like the school that we both attended. And I thought, well, I've already done 10 years of hard labor in internment camp. I don't need any more of that. And now, so that was 37 years ago. And I've been all these 37 years based in Japan. So I realized that intuition that sent me to Japan and sent me to that temple was the correct one, but I wasn't grown up enough really to do justice to it then, and it took me a long, long time. But all these many years later, our life is pretty simple in this two-room rented flat, and so probably I'm living something akin to the life that I had imagined when I thought of coming to Japan. But it took me a long time to get here because I was slave to the romance for a long time and had to cut through it to get to something real. It's a little different from what we're talking about, but as I was rereading your book, a terrible question came to me, which is impossible, and you probably get asked it all the time. But since I haven't had a chance to talk to you for a long time, this is my chance to ask you, can you differentiate between the feelings and experiences that move you to write a poem and those for which you prompted to make a painting or maybe a sculpture or stained glass, but which draws you to the visual and which draws you to the poem form?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, and I realized I actually made a mistake in the book, in that I said at the beginning that Basho wasn't a painter, but in fact he was a painter. He did. And one of the things that I suppose that really sort of drew me to Chinese and Japanese sort of culture was this actual bringing together of sort of poetry and painting in such a sort of close that many of the sort of great Chinese painters were also great poets, and they would always include their sort of poems on their painting. I mean, obviously, calligraphy is one of the wonderful ways of actually, making this sort of connection between it. And I suppose it's why William Blake has been such an important person, because he sort of brought these sort of two things together in that way. And I find it actually very difficult to distinguish between the two. And um, I suppose I'm more often um, uh, the first thing that sort of speaks to me is often through the eyes, that I actually will sort of see somewhere, and that will that's the door that most easily opens. um, uh, and sort of the poems. I stopped writing poetry. I mean, I started, when I sort of first came back to Oxford, and then I stopped for about sort of 30 years or so and didn't write any more, partly because no one particularly seemed interested in it, and the kind of what people respond to does determine what you produce, really. That's the but then. Um, I think it was actually when I did a window for the little church here in Ifley, and it just it I just find a sort of poem sort of coming out of that, and so since then it sort of again just opened in a sort of new door, and I sort of started doing all these poems again, and now whenever I do a painting, I tend to do a poem at the same time, partly to explain to me what the what the painting is about, but also to take it. Yeah, it's been an interesting kind of new journey for me. Um,
Love that. So actually, in these recent instances, the painting is coming first because when I read your book, the way it's laid out, it sometimes almost feels as if the poem came and then the painting is an illustration of the poem. But in truth, it's more often the reverse.
It's more often, but not always. I mean, sometimes it is sometimes the sort of poem that gives birth to the painting, and um yeah, it's hard to distinguish them, really. Uh, and yeah, no, I'm just sort of reading um Blake again at the moment, and I when you read the sort of quite difficult sort of prophecies and things, which when I first read them, I'd made no sense to me at all. But actually reading, because you can now sort of read them uh, see them online with the actual illustrations, and the illustrations don't illustrate them at all. They go off in weird sort of directions, and yet they somehow enable you to enter into this sort of strange vocabulary and and images and things. So yeah, it's again, it's this kind of linking thing that we were talking about, that the two things that can be very different can actually yet take you in a different way beyond themselves, which I suppose is very much what we've been talking about. Um, but actually, also wanted to, I mean, because I think one of the most moving bits in your book is right towards the end, um, when when Hiroko, your wife, comes to the monastery for the first time, and that's really that's so touching. I mean, she has no. I mean, you say you've been quite hesitant in sort of taking part in any of them, Mike, but she sort of plunges sort of straight into
Yes, yeah.
to that. But also says, I mean, it's just a line that really sort of got me when I read it. She says, for 30 years, I thought you were an only child, and now I see you have all these brothers, which I just thought was so lovely. And I
I
suppose
agree.
it's true.
Yes. And it must be said that when she delivered that line, she didn't realize that the word we use for monks is brothers. She
Right.
just could feel the warmth and kindness that over 30 years. I mean, these are some of my most intimate friends in the world, these monks. Not partly because I've spent so much time with them for 30 years, but also the time I've spent, and you will understand this, is sort of naked and deep. It's not games and it's not small talk, and you were relating. It's a very unusual level. And when she first came there, it was so sweet because just before she delivered that line, as you said, she was very keen to go to Eucharist and then to take communion, although she's a brilliant, devout Buddhist. But she says, you know, I'm Japanese, so when we go to India, we want to be in the temple, and when we go to Israel, we want to be in the synagogue, and when we come to the West, we want to go to a church. She makes a beeline for every church now. And at the end of the service, one monk after another came up to say hello to her. They were so really excited to meet you. You know, we've known Pico for 30 years. We didn't know you existed. We thought you were just fiction. We're so happy. You know, welcome, welcome. I think she was overwhelmed by the warmth they brought to her. And then, as we stepped out of the chapel, she delivered that line. And yeah, thank you for registering it. I think too, it's a very touching. It's very touching human line. And I remember, again, it's in the book, but when I first went there, there was one day, I'd probably been staying there about a year, when I drove down, because I was staying there for a long time, to a little payphone at the bottom of the hill under the monastery to call her. She was in Japan, and there I was in Big Sur. And she could just hear all the joy in my life and my voice. And it was a spring day, and the slopes were filled with golden poppies and purple lupins, and there was blue-green water coming against the rocks right below me. It was paradisal setting, and she could hear all this joy in my voice. And she said to me, you know, I would never be worried if you met another woman because I could be more excellent. But how could I compete with the temple? And that so shook me and it went right through me. And that's when I decided really to make a commitment to her. And so 25 years later, when she started coming to the temple and staying there with me, I thought this is wonderful. What once she rightly perceived as a rival, now she can see as a friend and a companion, and she can make a part of her life too. And again, it really speaks for the remarkable open-mindedness of the monks that they make space for everybody. I mean, they really do treat everyone who arrives on their doorstep as if they're Jesus. And although that's their promise, it's a hard one to live up to, but they do. And when you were talking about William Blake, I was suddenly remembering the lovely moment in your book where I think Samuel Palmer came to him, as it were, in a job interview, and
Yeah.
William Blake said, "Do you write with fear and trembling?" Uh, I mean, I learned so much about these great figures, even though your text is relatively short. There's so much going on in it. And suddenly, Milton and Bunyan and Blake, whom I sort of knew from studying literature, came alive to me and became friends. But I thought, well, there's the ultimate question that anyone doing a job interview ought to ask. They'll cut through this, they'll sniff the wheat from the chaff pretty instantly, probably.
Yes, no, it was lovely. This this very young man, and um, and Palmer says, yes, yes, I do. And Blake says, you'll do.
Yes.
Which I think is just lovely. Well, I thought we might end this right at the beginning, as you just say. There's the picture that's on the cover of my book, and is the final picture is this picture of Bardsey Island, which is I mean, combines the sort of ocean and the sort of pilgrimage. It's a place where in the Middle Ages pilgrims used to gather and sort of go to Bardsey, and um, uh, my friend, the composer Jack Redford, has just written this lovely setting of these words you talked about from Julian of Norwich, which Eliot, of course, includes in the four quartets, which is all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, through the purification of motive in the ground of our beseeching, which is these words that kind of came to Julian as a kind of, she called them a showing, and she didn't really know what they meant, and struggled throughout her life to, how do you reconcile this with the sort of teaching of Holy Church and things, and yet she felt, and I think everyone who reads them feels, that they are telling us something very important. And as you were saying, it's in this time of the world that they seem have a particular sort of well, we need that vision, really, don't we? That so I thought it might be nice to end with a whole it's a little piece from Jack and showing the picture. But so I'll end with that. But it's been such a joy having this conversation. I so the book is coming out in England in
Early February, so a few, just not long from now.
yeah. So I'm not quite sure when this will go out, but probably the book will shortly follow, and it's called Learning from Silence. And but actually, that is the image on the back. I hope with you can see. I'll hold it right up, which is just lovely. Uh, and um, uh, and yes, all the details of this and also of Jack's piece will be on the in the notes below. So. Thank you, Pico, and hopefully we'll talk again when other books in your series, which I don't know what you're working on now, but anyway, I won't ask about that. That'd be a whole new conversation. But let's
Yes,
listen.
I think we've only met really once in 50 years since we left school, and that was in Kyoto. So it's a real joy to see you again, and so much more to talk about. So yeah, I'm also looking forward to the next time already. Thank you, Roger.
Well, let's listen to Jack's piece, and here we are.